Welcome to the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. I'm your host, Kate Powell. In a world where humans who feel vibrant, whole, and fully alive seem to be increasingly rare, where burnout and brokenness seem to be increasingly the norm, both in individuals and our larger ecosystems, it seems worth exploring how did we get here? And more importantly, what perspectives or what cultural practices or what spiritual, ancestral, or animist wisdom processes might help us stay true to the spark and rhythm of our aliveness on this wild, heartbreaking, but ultimately rare and precious life. Thank you for being here. May these conversations help us to stay human in the face of dehumanizing forces. May they nourish our wild, tender hearts, and may they plant seeds which flourish into a more regenerative and vibrant future. Hey, Kate here with Wild Sacred Journey. So I'm going to keep talking a little bit more about purpose, anxiety, and burnout. But today I want to kind of talk about it from this idea of like, we all have a fire within us, a certain amount of it. And each of us might have a slightly different amount of it, or each of us might have like different cycles, like longer or shorter cycles of it. So kind of like how long we can run off our fire before we have to like feed it, tend it, bank it a little, right? To keep it healthy, to keep it vibrant. So that's going to change, but we all have a certain amount of fire. And so, burnout, part of what I think is so powerful about that phrase even is that burnout itself sort of speaks to that fire. Our fire's burnt out. We feel empty. We feel a little dead inside. We feel, hollow, depleted, like we don't have our usual up and go, right? And, part of why we end up in that place, and I've talked about this, the relationship versus resource, right? Like animist world, if we believe everything has a consciousness, everything has an aliveness to it, then everything is something we can be in relationship with rather than a resource or something we can use, which is more what empire, industrialization, colonization, whatever we want to call it, would have us think of things more as resources, right? And so it's the same, we end up doing that to ourselves. We end up using our fire as a resource because we're taught to do that. We're taught to do that in school. We're taught to do that in the job force, right? Like it's in the culture. Certainly for those of us in what we would call the Western world, although it's spread to a lot of places by this point. So we have this fire and we've been taught to kind of use it like a machine, like just a constant source of power that powers the machine that is us, right? And so we end up with, to go along with that, not only is there the rewards, quote unquote, that we get for that, safety, stability, security, money, right? Those are the promises. That's not necessarily what we get, but that's kind of the promise. But there's also the flip side of that coin, which is what we fear if we don't do that, which is being lazy, right? Not being productive, not contributing. And so I've talked a little bit before too in other episodes about how like our genuine kernels of desires, of needs can get tangled up with wounds, right? So we all most humans desire to be a contribution in some way. So it gets very subtle and very almost sneaky, the way that kind of gets very quickly, but also, like I said, subtly twisted, co-opted into this sort of laziness, right? Into this fear of laziness, into this fear of not being productive. And that we're defining that because we live in these cultures where the waters that we swim in are all about being more like machines. Because we live in those cultures, then when we view those words, we're viewing them through this capitalist lens. So we end up taking our desire to have purpose, our desire to contribute meaning, to contribute, to contribute something, and we take that and we become like very quickly, we then start to approach it with this fear of laziness, with this fear of, lack in a lot of ways. And so when we do that, then we're just using our fire, right? It's like we expect it to be like, an outlet where we just plug something in and power just comes out unendingly, right? And I mean, that's not actually, we don't have, even the natural world doesn't have unending sources of power, right? That's a lie that we're rapidly eating up slower renewing resources to keep perpetuating. But our bodies certainly don't operate that way. So why is this important? Because we actually need our fire, and particularly in these times that I think we can all feel are coming, these revolutionary times, this peeling back the veil of the illusion that someone's coming to save us, or that the power lies outside of us, or that if we give enough, we'll be safe. If we take care of enough, if we sacrifice ourselves enough, we'll be safe, right? We'll gain safety. And I think many of us have been living some maybe unconscious or subconscious version of that for a long time. And my sense is these times are asking us to have a reckoning with that, and to get really responsible for our own power. So that means becoming more responsible for the stewarding of our own fire, right? There is such a thing as healthy generative conflict. There is such a thing as healthy generative aggression, actually. There's such a thing as these healthy generative charged states. And we can't access those if we're burnt out. And we're burnt out because we're misappropriating the aspects of us, our energy centers, that could be giving us the charge we need for the healthy generative charged states. So we're funneling all of what we could be using to take that healthy generative fight, right? We could be funneling all that we could be using for that into not being lazy, into being productive, into finding our purpose, but finding our purpose from this fear of laziness, from this fear of not being productive, right? So if that's the fear that's driving those things, then it's going to taint what we're doing. It's going to taint the search. It's going to taint how we approach it. And we become very easy prey for capitalist solutions, power outside of us solutions. We become easy prey for all the marketing tactics and so-called teachers and gurus and whatever all else who actually want to take our power and use it for themselves, not help us uplift our own power. So one of the things that I think we have to do in these moments, if we're wanting to even consider burnout recovery as a possibility, because it's not going to be possible. There is no amount of vacationing that will be enough if we aren't changing the fundamental approach to how we relate to our own energy resources and the energy resources of the world. So we have to fundamentally shift the culture if we want to ever have burnout recovery, long-term sustainable burnout recovery. And that feels like a really big fucking thing, right? But the beauty is we don't individually have to do it, right? The individual hero savior is another lie. That, again, if we find our purpose and we're not lazy, that we can be that. Don't worry about that. All we have to do is rewire that within ourselves, rewire our relationship to our own fire within ourselves, unlearn the fear of being lazy, being seen as lazy, right? Because a lot of times what we're judging, start to notice within yourself, what you're judging as lazy within yourself is probably your body trying to tell you it needs a break, or that you're misapplying your fire and your personal energy to causes that aren't actually important to you, or, that don't give you anything back. I think it's just pointing to that we're misappropriating our energy and we haven't rested enough, or we're not caring for it in the ways that it needs to be cared for, intended to. So, if we start to unlearn some of that within ourselves, I think we'll start to change culture, because our boundaries will change. There are things that we won't let people get away with in their behavior towards us or their expectations for us. We may be able to apply our creative thinking skills to finding new ways of approaching things that aren't rooted in these more unconscious, subconscious fears. And that's part of where shadow work comes in, right? Because that's where those unconscious, subconscious things lie, are in the shadows. That's why we call it shadow work, is, just because it's the stuff that it hasn't been brought forth to the light of our consciousness yet. And so it's kind of running these unexamined protocols, right? It's like we're running on programming that we haven't actually examined. And so we're assuming it's innate. We're assuming it's natural. And maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. And that's where, going into the shadows, looking at our shadows, is about getting clearer on what programs we're kind of running, so that we can decide, wait, maybe that isn't actually innate. Maybe that doesn't actually have to be that way. So how do we start to unlearn laziness, or the lie of laziness, or which Dr. Devin Price has a book called Laziness Does Not Exist, and he talks about the lie of laziness. So how do we unlearn, kind of this false idea? How do we kind of start to reprogram our nervous system, so that our nervous system doesn't go from this like always on, always on, always on, always on state to like collapsed and dead, but to actually have more access to the in-betweens, right? How do we do that? So last year, when I first got to Scotland, I was really, I knew I was burnt out, but I did not realize how bad it was. And so I kind of made myself a promise. I scaled way back on work, and I was on a little bit of a pilgrimage sabbatical, and I made myself a promise of like, okay, I'm going to see if I can do things that bring me joy. And at first I was like, do I even know what brings me joy? And so I was like, okay, I think I'll go hiking, because I think I like hiking. And I was walking up, some of you may have heard me tell this story, but anyway, I was walking up some really steep, hillside somewhere. And I'm like huffing and puffing as I'm walking up. And I remember thinking like, is this fun? Like, is this actually pleasure? Do I actually enjoy this? But I was noticing I was smiling, and I was like, okay, I think I enjoy this. And so then I started to get curious. And if you listen to my podcast on pilgrimage and kind of the attitude of pilgrimage, you'll hear me talk some about why I think curiosity is like a really important space to cultivate. It has us not jumping right to our preconditioned answers, right? A lot of that shadowy conditioning comes in jumping right to answers, right? And assuming that how we see things is like the be all end all, right? That's part of how they stay unexamined. Whereas curiosity allows us to examine things a little bit more. It allows us to be a little bit more soft, a little bit softer, a little bit more open. So I'm huffing and puffing up this hill, and I'm noticing like strain just like building in my body. And I'm like, what is that about? And I started realizing that my muscles weren't really relaxing in between each step, So one leg would be pushing and the other leg, as one leg pushes, the other leg sort of more or less releases. I mean, the front and back of your legs muscles are doing different things if you want to get really technical about it. But in general, for our purposes, right, like we kind of have this action of like one is activating and one can release, and one is activating and one can release. And the same with the breath, right? Comes in, goes out, comes in, goes out. And actually my hand's doing the wrong gesture. Most of us breathe correctly. We think inhale is up and we think exhale is down. When in reality, inhale actually moves your diaphragm and your pelvic floor down. And the exhale comes from your pelvic floor lifting up and your diaphragm lifting up to help press the air out. So something to pay attention to, and just tune in right now to your breath. And so just do it with me. Let's do it right now. So taking a breath in, see if your body naturally imagines itself lifting up. And if so, that's okay, but just notice that. Release the breath too. So see if now as you breathe in, you can imagine your diaphragm and your pelvic floor even moving down. And then as you exhale, pelvic floor, and then diaphragm, lift up. And then inhale, roots you down. Exhale, draws up. And so keep that going for a few more moments. And so already I'm noticing that just by some of it's focusing on my breath, but also by breathing properly, my nervous system kind of came down a rung or two on the ladder. So when I'm hiking, sometimes I have to check in with that. Okay, what's my breath actually doing? So I noticed as I was hiking that I was feeling the strain, partly because I wasn't breathing properly and partly because my muscles weren't really relaxing. So I started kind of saying, okay, and it may be too that there's one side of your body. Often I think for many of us, it's our dominant side that relaxes even less than the non-dominant side. So we might even have one side of the body that tends to clench more. So for purposes of this exercise, if you're, doing it kind of quickly, like if you're out on a hike or something, you would want to maybe just pick one side of your body. And so as that foot comes down and presses into the ground, you'd want to think activate. And as that foot lifts, you'd want to think release. Activate, release. And you can even imagine it like a ball, right? Like coming up, dropping down, coming up, dropping down, coming up, dropping down, right? And the same with the breath. And see if you can kind of sync it with the breath so that as you're exhaling, you're really releasing. And as you're inhaling, you're expanding and taking in. And as you're exhaling, you're really releasing, right? So play around with that. And you can even stand up and, do it right now. It doesn't even have to be on a hike. You could do it slower, a slow walk. And see if you can take a step and feel like, okay, activate and release. Activate and release. And I noticed that just by doing that, my body actually naturally took a deeper breath in and out, which is often a sign our nervous system is shifting state and kind of releasing something. It's a sign energy is releasing. It's a sign that something's coming down. Activate, release. And see if you can notice too, is your release, it might be releasing, is it actually releasing all the way down, right? Like, is it going all the way to the basement? Or is it just kind of going down to the ground floor, right? Does that make sense? So play around with that and just start to notice when you're out doing things like, are you actually letting yourself come down? And just see if you can practice in these sort of low pressure kinds of places. Because part of unlearning something, rewiring our understanding of something is giving ourselves a viable and often better feeling option to take its place, right? It's much easier to let something go when we have something else ready to take its place that we actually might even like better. So I found that when I was practicing this hiking, And you'll have to let me know how it goes for you, whether you find a similar thing, because maybe you do, maybe you don't. I'm not sure what your experience will be. But yeah, so I'd love to hear. But what I found when I was hiking was I actually felt I just had more stamina. I was not nearly as tired. My muscles weren't nearly as sore the following days. And I felt like I could just go longer because I was resting in between. So I wasn't trying to stoke this big fire and keep it going while I pushed myself all the way to the top of the mountain, and then at this big crash, like on the way down the other side kind of thing, both metaphorically and literally. But it was this sense of, each step was its own activation and release. And so then I was able to climb mountains because it wasn't about the mountain. I was activating and releasing every moment of the way up it. And so the progress I was able to make in the long run felt easier and more sustainable because I wasn't tying my own personal energy reserves into some outcome, i.e. reaching the peak, right? I was taking care of my energy reserves the whole way there. And I think that might be the secret to these times. So I'm going to wrap this here now with that exercise, that little thing to kind of play with and think about. Again, I'd love to hear, if you give it a try, I'd love to hear what you think, what your experience is. And how you might notice whether this ties in with, fear of being seen as lazy, or how does this either challenge that or shift your understanding of that, or, whatever. Does this, and so, I started to say, so we start with kind of practicing in these low pressure ways, with something that we enjoy or something that feels, kind of low stakes, trusting that then as it kind of, if it feels good and right and lands in our nervous system in a deeper way, that then we'll actually maybe find it shifting how we're relating to work or to, conflict in our close relationships, or, whatever it might be that we that feel higher stakes because they feel more tied to our safety, our security, our stability, our belonging, our, all of that kind of stuff. So, So in these times where, it feels like we're going to be asked to dig really deep, and where I think a lot of us are feeling so burnt out already that feels like just one demand too much, I just think this is such important work. So anyway, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear, and I'll see you next time.